one of the things that came out of doing these walks, and I've been walking the dogs for years now, obviously, and when I first started walking them, I used to take notebooks and just write anything down I was thinking about at the time. The dogs didn't like me stopping, so that's why I started making these videos in the first place, just to kind of log what I was thinking about, I suppose, and to externalise what I was thinking about. Stop it cluttering up my head. But one of the things that emerged out of that, I guess it's because of the fact that I'm walking, is that walking and moving generally has become really kind of central to a lot of the things I'm thinking about, actually. Because certainly some of the things I think about are in terms of what I might broadly call knowledge, cognitive processes which result in some kind of structured arrangement of information that can be used to process other information. And it's not a very good definition, I know, but it's something like that I'm thinking about. So I'm not specifically looking at scientific, rational, empirical knowledge. I'm also looking at just the idea of knowledge and what that consists of. And when I was looking at that, what started to emerge was the significance of metaphor within knowledge gathering, knowledge organisation processes. You know, largely drawing off cognitive linguistics, cognitive poetics, the work of Lakoff and Johnson and those kind of people. And then within that kind of organisation, the particular relevance of space and the perception of space, the perception of objects in space, and how the various metaphors associated with objects, how those ideas become relevant in terms of knowledge organisation, knowledge gathering, expressions, and so on. And again, that borrows largely from Lakoff and Johnson, particularly Mark Johnson, and that quotation he has about knowledge emerging from capacities for object manipulation and bodily movement, those kind of things. And within that, there is this thing to do with movement. You know, I guess because I'm occupying space the whole time and my senses are perceiving spatial relationships around me the whole time, and my senses and my bodily interactions with objects, again, are configured and constrained by my understanding of space. What's particularly interesting to me is how movement through space figures as a kind of organising principle within that metaphorical structure. So that's, I think, I'm not quite sure which came first, actually. I think those ideas, that stuff to do with thinking about the significance of walking as a knowledge gathering process, I think that came. So I spend a lot of my time walking about and thinking at the same time, and so perhaps naturally my thinking turns to, or because it starts to become structured by, at least, or starts to draw on metaphors associated with walking and moving through space. So let me just see if I can recap for myself. One of the things I'm finding myself doing is thinking about metaphors of knowledge, and the particular set of metaphors that are, and how the concept, the abstract concept of knowledge is understood through some kind of embodied metaphor. And the metaphor which presents itself, because of the activity I'm engaged in largely, are metaphors of walking and moving through space. There is something of a history of that. It's not original to myself. There's been quite a lot of books written about walking. And as an idea, it features metaphorically in other kinds of practices, and in both in literal and in metaphorical sense. So when we talk about procedural knowledge, for example, which is usually associated with learning of a kind of rote skill, a kind of know-how, the acquisition of know-how, that's usually referred to as procedural knowledge. And proceeding is drawing on a mobile metaphor, a metaphor of walking or of travelling through space, the kind of putting one foot after the other that is associated with learning practices. Usually with procedural knowledge, the journey that you take, the the process that you go on is laid out in front of you with a very clear end point, at which there are already perhaps people who have acquired that skill, the expert standing at the end. They've acquired that skill by taking that procedure before you, by making that procedural walk along the learning space prior to you. So that's very much a walking metaphor, but it's associated with the acquisition of pre-existing skills and pre-existing knowledge. There's also, I think, built into that the idea of not just a set of skills, but the acquisition or the arrival of a certain kind of state, maybe a state of mind, a state of knowing, a state of consciousness, something like that. And procedures tend to be associated with that. And here I'm reminded of kind of spiritual exercises, actually. I know in a lot of medieval thought, the acquisition of religious and spiritual knowledge was seen as a kind of journey. I think I never read this. I can't remember where I read it exactly. I think it was in The Craft of Thought, in the book called The Craft of Thought by somebody called Carruthers. And that shows up in the design of medieval churches, which have this ductus, which is this journey that you walk through the church to the far end, which I think is called a scopus, maybe. But that journey through the literal space of medieval churches is associated with the metaphorical journey that you would take on a kind of spiritual path of enlightenment, if you like. You would be moving towards the position. So you perform the action in the church that you perform metaphorically in the pursuit of spiritual growth. But again, that's seen as a kind of journey, a kind of walking process. I think in that one, the end point is less clearly defined than how procedural knowledge is usually thought about. With procedural knowledge, as I say, it's usually the acquisition of a skill, and the end point is very well defined. When the end point is a state, as it is in spiritual practices, clearly that's not quite so simple. And perhaps another example of that might be the via negativa, the way of nothingness, that comes up in some other kinds of, I guess you might say, educational philosophies, where the student, if you like, the novice, the initiate, sets out on a journey of discovery, and there is no end point demarcated, and there are no landmarks. There is no pre-existing path laid out in the way that it would be with procedural knowledge, or the way that it would be in terms of a ductus with medieval spiritual acquisitions of knowledge. With a via negativa, there is simply the kind of negating of false steps. So if a novice is questing towards some kind of state or place or object of knowledge that lies at some distance from them, and they are felt by their tutors to be walking towards somewhere that's either very familiar or is clearly a path that's been explored before, it would be the role of the educator, the tutor, to guide them away from that towards the via negativa, towards the path of nothingness, the path that has not yet been followed. So again, that's very much a walking, moving metaphor of knowledge acquisition, but one in that last case where there isn't an end point. I think there's very specific things to do with walking, actually, which I'll try and pick up on, to do with the phenomenology of walking, which I'll try and think about and do in a later video. But right now, that's what I'm finding myself thinking about quite a lot, or drawing on quite a lot, thinking with quite a lot. Now this attempt to try to understand the various forms of knowing tend to draw on metaphors of space, and for myself tend to draw on movement through space and the various entailments and inferences that fall out of that to provide this kind of paradigmatic understanding of what the various knowledge forms might take.